"You're on my property, and I'm calling the sheriff!" she screeched, stomping through the woods in fuzzy pink slippers with a chihuahua under one arm and a clipboard in the other. That would have been shocking, if we hadn't been sitting on 1,200 acres of forest that had been in my family's name since 1954. It was like watching a bird yell at an airplane for flying through its sky. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. It had been the perfect plan. A quiet weekend camping trip with my best friend Connor deep in the woods, no phones, no traffic, no nagging bosses, just trees, stars, and the sound of a crackling fire. My grandfather had left me the land in his will a few years ago, but I'd never really done anything with it. Life had gotten busy, and the forest just sat there, undisturbed, quietly waiting for me to remember it existed. But lately, I'd been feeling the itch to disconnect from everything, and when Connor suggested a no-cell signal weekend, I remembered the old property and knew it was time. The first day was everything we hoped it would be. We set up camp by the riverbend, grilled steaks on an open flame, and took dips in the ice-cold water like we were kids again. It was the kind of place where time didn't seem to matter. No traffic, no Wi-Fi, just quiet, peaceful. Until Karen. We first heard her before we saw her, crunching through the underbrush like a wrecking ball in slippers. Connor looked up from his marshmallow just as the dog started barking like it had just spotted a squirrel armed with a bazooka. Then she emerged. Bathrobe, curlers, clutching a laminated HOA manual like it was a holy relic. Her face was locked in a permanent frown, the kind you get from a lifetime of judging people in line at the grocery store. "Who authorized you to camp here?" she demanded. Connor blinked. God. I snorted, but she didn't find it funny. Her eyes snapped to me. "This is protected land. I walk my dog here every morning, and I don't appreciate outsiders trashing it with campfires and whatever this is," she said, waving vaguely at our folding chairs like they were illegal contraband. I calmly stood up, dusted off my jeans, and reached into my backpack for the folded-up deed I always kept on hand. Not because I expected to need it, but because I knew that in the backwoods it's good to be prepared for anything. Bears, rain, or apparently irate slipper-wearing locals. "We're not outsiders," I said, unfolding the paper and holding it out. "My name's Eli. This land's been in my family for 70 years. We own all 1,200 acres. Karen stared at the document like it was written in ancient Egyptian. She didn't even touch it. "That's impossible," she scoffed. "My great-uncle hiked here every Sunday. This trail has been in our community for decades. You can't just claim a forest." Connor leaned in, whispering with a grin, "Pretty sure that's exactly how land ownership works." That only seemed to enrage her more. She turned on her heel, her dog yipping furiously as it bounced in her arm like an angry popcorn kernel. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You think you can just show up and pretend to own the place? Well, I know people." "I do too," I said, smiling. "Like my lawyer cousin and the county assessor." But she was already storming off into the trees, the slap of her slippers fading with every angry step. We stood there for a second in stunned silence. Then Connor turned back to the fire and said, "So, Esmores?" We both laughed, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a prickle of unease. Karen wasn't just a busybody. There was something a little too unhinged about her rage, like a shaken soda bottle waiting to explode. And unfortunately for us, she wasn't done yet. The next morning started off normal enough. We made coffee over the fire, skipped rocks on the river, and watched deer wander through the trees like we were in a postcard. It was easy to forget the screeching banshee from the night before. That is, until we heard the low hum of an ATV and saw the flash of neon orange out of the corner of our eyes. Karen returned with reinforcements. Well, if you count a spray can of tree marking paint and a giant binder full of what looked like laminated Google Maps printouts as reinforcements. She drove straight through the clearing like she was a park ranger from a very low-budget movie, hopped off the ATV, and started marking trees with big red XS. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping forward. Identifying diseased trees for removal, she said without turning around. It's a safety hazard. Pretty sure the only thing diseased is your grasp on reality, Connor muttered under his breath. Karen whirled around and pointed her clipboard at him like it was a weapon. You're going to be fined. This whole setup is illegal. By who? The Society of Angry Forest Ladies. Her face turned a shade of purple that made me think we might need to call for medical attention. But before she could launch into another rant, I walked back to the tent, pulled out my phone, still on airplane mode but loaded with PDFs, and opened the full topographic land survey. The borders were clear. We weren't just camping on my family's property, we were miles deep into it. Karen was the intruder. She refused to look. She stormed off again, this time shouting over her shoulder about bringing the sheriff. Connor looked at me and said, "I give her 2 days before she's back with a chainsaw and a goat." I chuckled, but the truth was, it felt like something bigger was coming. Karen wasn't just someone you annoyed once and forgot about. She was the kind of person who turned mild irritation into a vendetta. And if she really believed she had some claim to this land, we were in for one wild weekend. Still, we weren't worried. We had the paperwork, the right, and the marshmallows. What we didn't have was any idea just how far Karen was willing to go. By sunrise, we had new visitors, though not the kind we expected in the middle of a secluded forest. I was pouring hot water into a tin cup of instant coffee when I heard the unmistakable rumble of an engine. Not a truck. Not an ATV this time. A chainsaw. And not the good kind of chainsaw either, like someone responsibly clearing out dead wood. No, this was angry chainsawing. Revenge chainsawing. Karen chainsawing. She came stomping into our clearing like a woman on a mission. No robe this time. Now she was dressed in a bright orange safety vest 2 sizes too small and a neon visor with the words, "Volunteer Forest Warden," written in glitter glue across the front. In one hand, she held a clipboard again, this one laminated with color-coded tabs. In the other, she revved the chainsaw like she was starring in her own backwoods action movie. Her dog trailed behind in a rhinestone harness, barking with the determination of a chihuahua that truly believed it was a Doberman. Connor, halfway through a bite of beef jerky, looked over and said, "And so it begins." Karen started walking up to trees, slapping neon orange tape around their trunks, then checking boxes on her clipboard with dramatic pen flourishes. When she saw us watching her, she raised her voice as if narrating to an audience. "These trees are unstable. Fire hazard. You're in violation of Environmental Safety Code. I'll be submitting this report to the community board." I stood up slowly. "There is no community board. This is private land." She barely glanced at me. "We'll see what the sheriff has to say about that." Connor tilted his head. "So your plan is to call the sheriff on us for cutting firewood on our land, while you walk around with a chainsaw and vandalize healthy trees?" Karen ignored him and continued her tree-tagging spree, eventually walking right into our camp and marking the tree that shaded our tent. Then, in what had to be the most baffling escalation yet, she walked over to our campfire, reached into a cloth tote bag slung across her shoulder, and pulled out a full bag of powdered cement. "What are you doing?" I asked, but it was too late. She dumped the cement directly into our fire pit like some kind of deranged witch casting a curse. The flames hissed and sputtered, then snuffed out in a puff of gray smoke. "There. Fire neutralized." "You're welcome," she said smugly, dusting her hands off. Connor stared at her, wide-eyed. Did she just concrete our fire? I walked over and pointed to the sign we'd posted on a tree nearby. The laminated notice from the county records office, proving our ownership and the legal right to camp, build fires, even put up small structures. Karen squinted at it, then turned to me with a crooked smile. "Forgery," she said, tapping her temple like she was revealing a grand conspiracy. "Nice try, but I've seen better Photoshop jobs on Etsy." Before I could respond, she turned, revved the chainsaw one last time for dramatic effect, and stomped off back into the woods, her little dog yapping like a backup singer for her rage. I let out a long breath and looked at the ruined fire pit. Cemented over. Unusable. Later that afternoon, we came back from a short hike and found the tent slashed in 3 places. Not animal scratches, straight, angry knife slashes. Our cooler had been turned over, ice melted and food strewn across the dirt. And to top it off, someone had taken bites out of 3 marshmallows and placed them carefully back in the bag like some kind of sugar-soaked calling card. "I think she left us a snack," Connor muttered, holding up a note that had been pinned to the folding chair with a butter knife. The note, written in suspiciously elegant cursive, read, "Nature deserves better. Go ruin a parking lot instead." We stood there in silence for a moment. The peaceful forest escape we'd envisioned had officially been hijacked by a rogue HOA warrior with too much free time and no understanding of property law. I wasn't sure whether to be angry or impressed by her creativity. But either way, it was time to fight back with facts. That evening, I called my cousin Nate, a land surveyor and part-time real estate attorney who, luckily, lived just an hour away. He was one of those guys who thrived on petty conflict, especially when it involved proving people wrong using documents and legal code. When I told him what had happened, he laughed for 2 full minutes, then told me he'd be there first thing in the morning. True to his word, Nate arrived in a beat-up truck with his measuring equipment, a box of donuts, and a briefcase full of land records. He was already wearing mirrored sunglasses and grinning like a man who just found out someone parked in his reserved spot. "Let's ruin her day," he said, biting into a jelly donut. We walked the entire perimeter of the property, marking boundary points, double-checking coordinate. Not only did our documents hold up, but Nate also discovered something wild. Karen's property line didn't even reach the edge of the forest. Her cabin, which she claimed as bordering the community preserve, was actually sitting 15 feet into our parcel. In other words, Karen wasn't just harassing us. She was technically trespassing every day she stepped outside her porch. Connor nearly dropped his water bottle laughing. "She's been yelling at us for camping while literally living on land she doesn't own?" Nate nodded. "Oh yeah. And I'm emailing you both the official survey map, the deed, and a drafted cease and desist. Let her call the sheriff now." We printed everything out, laminated it, and nailed it to a tree at the edge of the clearing, just in case she returned. And boy did she. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and we tried to rebuild our fire using a backup pit, Karen came creeping back. This time without the chainsaw. She just stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, dog quiet, her face unreadable. Then she saw the new sign. Her eyes scanned it, her lips twitched, and for the first time, she said nothing. She turned slowly and walked back the way she came, her pace slower, her shoulders tighter. Something told me she finally realized she might have picked the wrong forest to mess with. Connor exhaled and said, "I think the forest ghost has been exorcised." I wasn't so sure. Karen didn't strike me as someone who gave up after round 1. This was a woman who poured cement into someone else's fire pit. She was the kind of person who escalated until she either got her way or exploded. And judging by the look on her face, she was nowhere near done exploding. We might have won the legal round, but something told me Karen was about to get real creative. The next morning started with the sound of gravel crunching under tires and the lazy chirp of birds that hadn't yet realized their peaceful forest was now the setting for a full-on human turf war. I was sipping the first mug of coffee from our newly rebuilt fire pit when I heard Connor chuckle and mutter, "She called the cavalry." A dusty white sheriff's SUV rolled into the clearing, slow and deliberate. The door opened, and out stepped a broad-shouldered man in mirrored sunglasses, wide-brim hat, and a badge that glinted in the morning light. Sheriff Daniels. I hadn't seen him in years, not since my grandfather's funeral, but he looked exactly the same, like he'd been carved from oak and dipped in coffee grounds. And right behind him, arms crossed and smugness dialed up to 11, was Karen. She looked like she'd been preparing for this moment all night. fresh lipstick, ironed khakis, and a dog in a matching vest that read emotional support. I couldn't tell if the vest was real or something she'd made herself out of leftover craft supplies. Either way, she clearly thought she was about to watch us get thrown off her land in a spectacular victory lap. "Morning, boys," the sheriff said, tipping his hat and eyeing the camp. "I got a call from Miss Pennington here, said there were some unauthorized campers on her property." Before I could speak, Karen cut in, her voice syrupy sweet but trembling with rage. "They've been out here for days. Fires, noise, disturbing the wildlife, and I have it on good authority that they forged some kind of fake deed to squat on this land." Connor raised an eyebrow. "Fake deed? We laminated it." Sheriff Daniels held up a hand, cutting off the back and forth before it could escalate. "Let's just take a look at what we've got." I nodded and handed over the same documents Nate had sent: deed, land survey, and property boundaries. Everything official, notarized, with clear signatures and date. Daniels took his time reading through them, tracing the map with a finger, then looking around the clearing like he was mentally matching the lines on the page to the trees around him. Karen stood behind him, arms still crossed, foot tapping. After a long silence, Daniels handed the papers back to me and turned to Karen. "Well," he said slowly, "looks to me like this land belongs to Eli's family. Has for a long time. And according to this," he tapped the map, "your cabin's actually about 10, maybe 15 feet onto their parcel." Karen blinked like he'd just spoken another language. "That's impossible. My property line goes to the stream." Daniels shrugged. "Not according to the county. This is all official. I remember when Eli's granddad bought up most of this forest back in the 50s. Didn't want it turned into a logging road. Figured nature deserved a protector." Karen's mouth opened and closed a few times, no sound coming out. She looked like someone had unplugged her mid-tantrum. Then her voice returned, louder, shriller. "Well, that can't be legal. You can't just tell me my house is on someone else's land. There has to be a mistake." Daniels took off his sunglasses and looked her dead in the eye. "I don't make the maps, ma'am. But I do enforce the law. And what you're doing here, trespassing, vandalism, destruction of property, it doesn't look good. You keep poking the bear, it's gonna poke back." Karen sputtered, red-faced and suddenly without her usual fire. She turned on her heel, yanked her dog along by the leash, and stomped off back toward her cabin, muttering something about lawyers and conspiracies. Daniels waited until she was out of earshot before turning back to us. "She's a handful," he said with a smirk. "But looks like you've got your ducks in a row. You boys let me know if she tries anything else. And keep the fires small, yeah?" We nodded, and he tipped his hat again before walking back to his SUV and disappearing down the dirt trail. Connor let out a long whistle. "Did that just happen? Did we finally win a round?" I grinned. "Feels like it. But I don't trust her to take a loss quietly." Connor shook his head. "She'll come back with a bazooka and a PowerPoint presentation." As it turned out, he wasn't far off. That afternoon, Nate arrived. This time not just as a cousin, but as legal backup. He wore a crisp button-down shirt tucked into jeans, sunglasses on, briefcase in hand. The only thing missing was a theme song playing behind him. He walked into the clearing like he was preparing for court in the wilderness. "I heard the sheriff was here," he said, grinning. "Let me guess. Karen brought the apocalypse?" "More like brought a dog in a vest and an attitude," Connor said. Nate laughed, then pulled out a stack of envelopes and papers. "Good. Then it's time we take this up a notch." He had drafted a cease and desist letter, a formal notice that Karen's cabin was encroaching on our property, and a legal demand that she remove all her structures, or begin negotiations to purchase the land she was occupying at a price determined by us. And since she had already vandalized our camp, we also had the right to press charges or sue for damages. Nate said we'd hold off for now. But he wanted her to feel the pressure. We walked down the path to the property edge, where Karen's cabin stood like a crooked little fortress with gnome statues lining the porch like sentries. Nate knocked on the door. Karen opened it, eyes narrow, jaw clenched. "What now?" she snapped. Nate held out the envelope. "Formal notice. You're squatting on private land. You've got 30 days to either vacate or make us an offer." Karen snatched the envelope like it had insulted her personally, scanned the top few lines, and scoffed. "You think you can intimidate me with paperwork? This is my home. I'm not going anywhere." "That's fine," Nate said coolly. "Then every day you stay becomes a legal liability. You can fight it in court if you want, but you'll lose. And it'll cost you a lot more than you think." Karen slammed the door in his face. We walked back to camp, and for a while, everything was quiet, peaceful, even. For the first time since we arrived, it felt like maybe, just maybe, this battle was turning in our favor. Nate stayed for dinner, and the sheriff even returned with a six-pack and a camp chair, saying he was off duty and tired of small-town drama. We all sat around the fire that night, laughing, eating, swapping old stories, and savoring the slow burn of a well-earned win. But none of us were naive enough to believe it was over. Not with Karen. If we'd learned anything, it was that she didn't just lose quietly. And as we'd soon find out, her next move wasn't just angry, it was wildly public. The calm didn't last. We were finally starting to relax, thinking maybe Karen had realized she was beat, maybe she'd gone inside to Google how to gracefully admit defeat. But by the next morning, we realized that wasn't her style. Karen didn't retreat. She reloaded. The first sign was the flyer. It was pinned to a pine tree just off the trail that led toward the road. At first glance, it looked like some sort of event notice, bright red letters, clip art of trees, and bold text that read Community Forest Preservation Barbecue, stand against illegal occupation. Beneath that, it said, hosted by concerned citizens, protecting OUR land. Connor tore it down, laughing. "Oh, she's throwing a protest? In the middle of the woods." I read the fine print. It was scheduled for Saturday. She was inviting people to raise awareness of illegal activity, unregulated development, and environmental abuse by squatters currently camping on conservation land. She even had a note about bringing your own reusable cutlery to minimize environmental damage, as if she was fighting for the Amazon rainforest and not trying to get revenge because we wouldn't pack up and leave our own forest. I looked at Connor and shook my head. She's throwing a fake protest on land she doesn't own, about people who do own it. That's next level. The day came faster than expected. Saturday morning rolled around, and it started with a slow stream of unfamiliar cars parking near the trailhead. Some folks wandered in carrying picnic baskets, reusable water bottles, and folding chairs. Most looked confused, like they thought they were arriving at a church potluck, but had taken a wrong turn into a conspiracy theory meeting. A few had matching shirts that read, "Save the Trees." One guy had binoculars and a notebook, and kept asking if we'd seen any eagles nearby. Karen arrived at noon, in full force. She had a whistle, a megaphone, and a vest that said Event Coordinator. The dog was now in a wagon with a tiny umbrella attached. She set up a folding table covered in pamphlets, clipboards for signatures, and a sign that read Petition to Reclaim Community Land. It was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality, that Connor stood there, mouth open, holding a stick of beef jerky like he'd forgotten what food was. "You think she'd notice the irony," he mumbled. It didn't stop there. Karen gave a speech. Into the megaphone. Loud and proud, like she was announcing a revolution. "We will not be bullied off land that belongs to the people," she shouted to the dozen or so confused attendees. "This sacred forest has been walked by our ancestors, enjoyed by children, respected by neighbors. And now? It's being defiled by squatters with fake documents and outdoor grills." That part earned a few claps, but then Nate stepped in. He walked up to the table, grabbed a flyer, read it with a raised eyebrow, then turned to the group and said, "Hey everyone, just so you know, I'm the legal representative for the landowners she's talking about. This entire forest, including the space you're standing on, is privately owned. By our family. We have the deed, county approval, and full rights to be here. A few people looked around awkwardly. One woman slowly lowered her protest sign. A man holding a compostable plate of pasta salad squinted at Karen like he was doing the math in his head and realizing he might be on the wrong team. Karen's face twisted. This is a disinformation campaign. They're frauds. They tricked the county with fake maps. Nate pulled out the land deed, handed a copy to the nearest person, and said, "You're welcome to verify it yourself. I'd also recommend not trespassing here again once this little picnic is over." "Thanks." Karen shrieked, actually shrieked, and tried to snatch the deed back from the woman reading it. But the woman yanked it away, muttered something about not liking being lied to, and walked off with her pasta salad. Within 10 minutes, most of the crowd had awkwardly dispersed, mumbling thanks or apologies as they slipped away into the woods. Karen, left with only her dog and her folding table, stood there shaking. Her voice was hoarse from yelling into the megaphone. Her grand protest had collapsed like a sad balloon, and she looked ready to combust. But she didn't lash out this time. She just packed up quietly, eyes cold, and pushed her wagon dog back toward the trail like a general retreating after a failed siege. That night, back at camp, we finally exhaled. For the first time, it felt like maybe she was done. We sat by the fire, drinking beer and laughing about the man with the Eagle notebook. Nate had already posted clips of her speech online, and within hours, it was spreading like wildfire across local Facebook group. The caption: "Local Karen tries to reclaim forest, accidentally hosts barbecue on someone else's land." The comments were ruthless. One guy wrote, "Next time she should protest at Costco and demand ownership of aisle 12. Another said, "The forest said no, Karen. We thought the worst was over." But the next day, we went on a short hike and stumbled across something none of us expected. About a quarter-mile from our camp, just off the main trail, we found a half-buried steel hatch camouflaged beneath an old tree stump. It looked like something out of a Cold War bunker movie. Rusty, covered in moss, but solid. Connor looked at me. "Is that what I think it is?" Nate knelt down, pried it open, and shined his flashlight into the dark space below. Wooden stairs, crate, a metal cot, a few sealed boxes, and on the wall, an old family crest burned into a wooden plaque. We climbed down, dust swirling around us, until we reached the bottom. It was like stepping back in time. Shelves lined with canned food, tools, and documents wrapped in oilcloth. One box held old maps and letters, handwritten in my grandfather's script. Among them, a document marked Land Stewardship Clause, Emergency Protocol. Nate read it, eyes wide. This says that if any non-authorized structure or inhabitant is discovered squatting on the land, and if notice is given and ignored, the owners have legal grounds to issue daily fines, up to $100 per day, after 30 days of noncompliance. I laugh. "Grandpa put in a squatter clause?" Connor grinned. "Looks like the forest really does protect itself." We took the document back to camp and laminated it. Again. We were going to build something next. Not just another warning sign. A toll booth. Just symbolic. But legally sound. And as Karen would soon discover, it was about to cost her more than just her pride. The toll booth wasn't big. Just a simple wooden post with a hand-painted sign, but it stood tall and proud right at the bend in the path where Karen's ATV always emerged from the trees. We built it that morning after discovering the bunker and the emergency clause. Connor hammered the last nail while Nate drafted the printed notice that now hung beside the booth. Access to private land beyond this point requires permission from the owner. Unauthorized use will incur daily fines of $100, effective immediately. We even added a fake little security camera made from a broken GoPro and a piece of pipe just to sell the look. It wasn't about collecting actual money. It was about message and presence. Karen had played her games. This was ours. We didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, like clockwork, the familiar whine of Karen's ATV echoed through the woods. She slowed to a stop when she saw the booth, eyes narrowing behind oversized sunglasses. Her dog barked once, then immediately cowered when she turned and hissed, "Quiet." Karen stepped off the vehicle like she was descending a royal carriage and marched up to the sign. She read it once, twice, then turned to us where we stood at the fire pit, just watching. She pointed a trembling finger in the air. "You're not allowed to block my access to my own property." "That's the thing," Nate called back casually. "It's not your property. And the access road you've been using? That runs through our parcel. The one you're technically trespassing on every day." Karen's lips curled as she stormed toward us. "You're bluffing. You can't charge me to access my own home. That's extortion." "Not extortion," Nate said, holding up a copy of the old stewardship clause. "It's legal enforcement of land use. You've been given notice. You've refused to negotiate. Now the clock starts ticking. $100. Every day." Her eyes darted to me, then back to the toll booth. She looked around like maybe someone would jump out and say it was a prank. But no one came. This wasn't a joke. This was the forest pushing back. She screamed. Just let it out, like a teakettle of rage exploding into the woods. Then she stomped back to her ATV, kicked it into gear, and peeled away so fast she nearly hit a sapling. We didn't see her for the rest of the day. That night, around the fire, we couldn't stop laughing. It felt like a turning point, like we'd finally won some strange backwoods chess match. Nate toasted with a soda and said, "Nothing like a little paperwork to turn chaos into order." But we were wrong to think she was done. Because Karen didn't disappear. She regrouped. 2 days later, a man in a polo shirt and khakis arrived in a white SUV with a clipboard of his own. A real estate agent. Sent, apparently, to initiate negotiation on Karen's behalf. He walked up to us with a wary smile, obviously briefed on the situation, and asked if we'd be willing to discuss selling the plot of land her house sat on. Nate grinned so wide I thought he might break his own face. "We're open to an offer," he said smoothly. "But you should know we have no intention of selling cheap. That parcel holds sentimental value. Been in the family a long time." The man nodded. "Of course. We understand. Karen's very eager to resolve this amicably." "She's eager now?" Connor muttered. "Last week she poured cement in our fire pit." Nate ignored him and handed over a sealed envelope. "Here's our offer. Take it to her. You have 7 days." The man left. The envelope? It contained a single-page contract offering to sell Karen the sliver of land her cabin encroached upon, for $1 million. It wasn't a joke. We'd done the math. Factoring in property value, nuisance damages, and legal costs of removal, it was a legitimate price point. Ridiculous? Sure. But not illegal. And we were more than willing to go through with it. For 2 days there was silence. No ATV. No flyers. No protesters. Just birds, breeze, and the distant rustle of deer. Then, just before sunset on the 3rd evening, we heard the slow crunch of cautious footsteps on the gravel. Karen appeared from the trees, not dressed in robes or vests or glitter signs. She wore jeans and a plain sweater. Her dog wasn't with her. She walked slowly up to the booth, where we happened to be sipping coffee and watching the sun filter through the canopy. She didn't speak for a long time. Just stared at the booth. Then she looked up at me. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said quietly. "I didn't know you really owned it all." I nodded but didn't answer. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she added, voice strained. "But I can't move. That's my home. Everything I've put into it. I can't just walk away." Nate stood up beside me and said, "Then you can buy it." She pulled a folded check from her back pocket. It was written out in full. $1 million. Signed and dated. The whole thing felt surreal. A week ago, she was screaming about community heritage and forged map. Now, she was handing us a life-changing sum to keep her porch. We didn't say much after that. Just shook hands, traded signatures, and watched her walk away. Slowly, quietly. Her war was over. The money hit the account the next day. Nate handled all the legal transfers. Connor and I spent the next week talking about what to do with it. We decided to build something real. Not just a camp. An actual eco-retreat. Cabins for veterans. Hiking trails. A spot for local school kids to learn about nature. My grandfather always said the forest wasn't for taking, it was for sharing, as long as people respected it. And now we had the means to do exactly that. The sheriff dropped by one last time with a gift, a wood-burn sign that said Peaceful Pines. Said it used to hang in my grandfather's old workshop. We hung it at the edge of the trail, just past where the toll booth used to be. We kept the booth up though, as a joke. People loved taking pictures with it. That night, around the fire, we toasted to the weirdest camping trip of our lives. From chainsaws to lawsuits, concrete to cabin sales, the forest had thrown us into the kind of story no one would believe unless they lived it. But here we were. Oh, laughing, grateful. A branch snapped in the distance. We turned our heads, alert. Then a black bear ambled into the clearing, sniffed the air, and looked straight at us. We froze. It blinked, sneezed, and waddled away like we were barely worth the effort. Connor exhaled. Thank God. For a second I thought Karen was back in a fursuit. We laughed so hard the fire nearly went out. And just like that, the forest was quiet again. Ours.